Episode 132, is the sugar industry behind the obesity epidemic and the science that hid it? Welcome back to the Conspiracy Theory Analyst. I'm Robin. In 1967, a review article appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine, one of the most prestigious medical journals in the world. It examined the research on diet and heart disease and reached a clear conclusion. Dietary fat was the culprit. Sugar was not a significant concern. The article was written by prominent Harvard nutrition scientists. It was influential. It shaped decades of dietary guidelines, public health campaigns, and food industry reformulation that produced the low-fat, high-sugar products that dominated Western diets from the 1980s onward. In 2016, researchers at the University of California, San Francisco published a cache of internal documents from the Sugar Research Foundation. The documents showed that the foundation had paid those Harvard scientists the equivalent of $50,000 in today's money to produce that review. The studies used were handpicked by the sugar industry. The funding was not disclosed. Tonight we examine what those documents proved, what they didn't prove, and what the ongoing debate around sugar, fat, and the obesity epidemic actually looks like in 2026. Detailed explanation: the obesity epidemic is not in dispute. Globally, obesity rates have roughly tripled since 1975. In the United States, approximately 42% of adults are obese. The health consequences: diabetes, cardiovascular disease, joint disease, certain cancers, cost hundreds of billions of dollars annually and reduce quality and length of life for hundreds of millions of people. The scientific question of what caused this epidemic and what dietary factors drive obesity has been one of the most contested in nutrition science for decades. For most of the second half of the 20th century, the dominant scientific and governmental consensus pointed to dietary fat, saturated fat in particular, as the primary driver of heart disease and metabolic disorder. This consensus shaped the U.S. dietary guidelines, food labeling, and the food industry's product reformulation from the 1970s onward. Low-fat products proliferated. Sugar was used to replace the palatability lost when fat was removed. By the 2010s, the scientific consensus had shifted significantly. Multiple large-scale meta-analyses found that the relationship between dietary fat and cardiovascular disease was more complex than the original consensus held. The role of sugar, particularly added sugar and high-fructose corn syrup, in obesity and metabolic disease received substantially more attention. And the UCSF investigation into the 1967 Harvard paper revealed that the original consensus had been shaped, at least in part, by industry-funded research that was never disclosed. Core element of the story: the first element is the 1967 Harvard paper. The documents published in JAMA Internal Medicine in 2016 are real and specific. The Sugar Research Foundation paid Harvard scientists. The studies used in the review were selected by the industry group. The paper minimized sugar's role in heart disease and emphasized fat. The funding was not disclosed. The New England Journal of Medicine published it without disclosure requirements, which were not standard at the time, but became so afterward precisely because of scandals like this one. The second element is the scope of the influence campaign. The 2016 UCSF investigation drew on documents showing that the sugar industry's influence campaign was systematic, funding researchers thought to be sympathetic, suppressing studies that showed harm, and coordinating with government agencies to shape dietary policy. One researcher described the parallels with tobacco industry tactics as disturbing. Some of the strategies the sugar industry used predated the tobacco playbook. The third element is the dietary guideline consequences. The dietary guidelines that emerged from the fat-focused consensus promoting low-fat, high-carbohydrate diets coincided with the beginning of the obesity epidemic. Whether the guidelines caused the epidemic, contributed to it, or were simply correlated with it is genuinely debated. What is not debated is that the low-fat era produced foods in which fat was replaced largely by sugar and refined carbohydrates. The fourth element is the ongoing industry influence. Research published in 2025 confirmed that the food and beverage industry continues to fund nutrition research, influence dietary guidelines, and shape public health messaging in ways that protect their commercial interests. The pattern identified in the 1967 documents did not end in 1967. Evidence for and against a conspiracy, the evidence that the sugar industry deliberately funded biased research and suppressed contrary findings, is documented in the 2016 JAMA Internal Medicine paper. The internal documents are real. The payments are confirmed. The lack of disclosure is established. This is not a theory. It is documented corporate behavior. The evidence for the strongest version of the conspiracy claim, that the sugar industry single-handedly caused the obesity epidemic by successfully suppressing all contrary science, is more contested. A 2018 paper in Science by Columbia University researchers argued that the UCSF documents, while real, did not prove that the sugar conspiracy was as decisive as claimed. Both supporters of the dietary fat theory and proponents of the sugar theory received industry funding in the 1960s. The National Dairy Council funded key studies supporting the fat theory. The scientific debate was genuinely complex, not simply manufactured by one industry's corruption. The obesity epidemic has multiple causes: sedentary lifestyles, ultra-processed food engineering, discussed in episode 77. The economics of food access, and metabolic factors that are still being researched. Attributing it primarily to a 1960s industry-funded review is a simplification of a complex multi-decade phenomenon. Arguments in favor believers in the stronger conspiracy framing argue that the internal documents demonstrate deliberate, organized suppression of science that harmed public health, and that this is exactly what the tobacco industry did, using the same playbook, with the same consequences. They note that the Harvard scientists who accepted industry funding and failed to disclose it were in positions of scientific authority, whose conclusions shaped public health for decades. The harm was real and measurable. They also argue that the ongoing industry influence on nutrition research, documented in 2025, demonstrates that the pattern identified in the 1960s has never stopped. The conspiracy did not end when the documents were exposed. It continued under different names and funding structures. Arguments against the conspiracy framing nutrition researchers who have examined the evidence argue that the 1967 paper, while ethically compromised by undisclosed funding, reflected a genuine scientific debate of the period rather than a fabricated one. Fat and heart disease was a legitimate research focus at the time, not a manufactured distraction. The paper's conclusions were in line with much of the mainstream science of its era, regardless of who paid for it. They also argue that framing the obesity epidemic as primarily the product of a corporate conspiracy, rather than as the result of complex interactions between technology, economics, food engineering, and biology, paradoxically reduces pressure for the systemic reforms that would actually address the problem. Public opinion and broader impact. The 2016 revelation about the 1967 paper generated enormous public attention and significantly accelerated the scientific and cultural shift away from fat as the primary dietary villain toward sugar. It contributed to sugar taxes, reformulation pressure on food companies, and a substantial change in how nutrition advice is communicated publicly. In 2026, the Make America Healthy Again agenda, associated with RFK Jr., has brought renewed political attention to the food industry's influence on science and policy, with sugar, ultra-processed foods, and food dye restrictions all under active regulatory consideration. Conclusion is the sugar industry behind the obesity epidemic and the science that hid it. The documented evidence confirms that the sugar industry paid for and shaped biased research in the 1960s that influenced dietary guidelines for decades. The consequences for public health were real. Whether this constitutes the primary cause of the obesity epidemic is a more complex question that the evidence does not fully support. For believers, the internal documents are the smoking gun, proof that corporate interests shaped the science, that shaped the food, that shaped the epidemic. For researchers who take a more nuanced view, the documents are evidence of real and serious corporate misconduct within a complex scientific debate that was never as simple as one industry's corruption. What is certain is this: The sugar industry paid Harvard scientists to write a paper that blamed fat and cleared sugar. They didn't disclose it. The paper influenced dietary guidelines for decades. And the obesity epidemic arrived on schedule. This is the Conspiracy Theory Analyst. I'm Robin. If tonight's episode made you think, please rate and follow on Spotify. Tomorrow on the Conspiracy Theory Analyst, the Order of the Nine Angles, the world's most dangerous secret society. That's next.